This time, I'm doing another history vid, and I said I was going to do it, and I'm doing World War II this time. Except, I'm going to split it up. I'm going to be talking about World War II in Europe right now, and I think maybe tomorrow I'll be talking about World War II in Asia. But for now, I'm doing the World War in Europe. Alright, so I just sort of searched up a map to do this on, and I'm going to explain it. So, let's start at the year 1936. Germany right now is pretty mad after losing World War I, which they did. They were not happy about it. They lost this land to Poland, and they're cut off from this bit right here, which is making them really unhappy. They also lost Alsace-Lorraine, which was a small region here, which they were proud of from their unification. So yeah, they were mad about losing World War I, and the Germans also had a bunch of other punishments, like they had to lower their military, they can't have an air force, or tanks, and their navy is extremely, small. So anyways, in 1936, it's unfortunate that this happened too, very bad. Hitler would take control of Germany, and the Nazi Party was now in control of Germany. It wasn't good. Anyways, when he took control of Germany, he enforced many harsh laws against people. He had bought into many conspiracy theories, believing that the German people were racially superior. It was really bad. Anyways, he got the public support from the people because he believed he can make Germany stronger and better. Anyways, his first move to make Germany better was in 1938. Also, before that, he had been expanding the military, and he had also made an air force, and he had been started building tanks. He also greatly improved the navy. Yeah, he geared it for war. Anyways, the Allies actually really didn't do much about this. They should have, though. Anyways, the Germans' forced territorial move was in 1938 when the territory of the state of Austria was annexed. He wanted to unify Germany, and Austria was German. It was pretty bad though. Anyways, Austria was annexed pretty forcefully. They were going to have a referendum whether they should join Germany, but they invaded them for it. But unsurprisingly, during that time, the Austrian people wanted to join Germany, and they actually cheered the German forces entering Austria. Yeah, it was bad. Anyways, Austria was annexed, and the Allies, they sort of did something in the League of Nations, although it never really worked. Anyways, Germany then turned their eyes to Czechoslovakia, and they noticed that they had a region called the Dayton Land, which was sort of, I don't know if you guys can see my mouse, or what's this called? I don't even know what this thing's called, I forgot. Clicker thing? It was basically just this area around here, which was full of ethnic Germans, and he wanted it. So I think it was called the London meeting, where they held a meeting in London deciding who would get the territory. And it was pretty rude what they did to Slovakia, as they were not invited, and Germany annexed the lands. Czechoslovakia should have at least been invited, so they can negotiate a deal with Germany, but instead Germany invades the territories after they made negotiations with the French and British. Anyways, Chamberlain actually, which was the leader of Britain, wanted to avoid a war with Germany. He should have went to war immediately though after he started increasing the military, and they should have saw what Hitler was doing in Germany. They should have just went to war immediately, but they didn't because Europe is still sort of recovering after World War I. Anyways, he actually held a celebration believing he has prevented another war, but unfortunately he didn't. A few months later, Germany invaded Czechoslovakia, and they annexed it. Anyways, the invasion of Czechoslovakia left a few territories disputed. The territory of Slovakia would be small land south of it would be given to Hungary. Hungary wanted to straight up annex Slovakia, which Hungary was an ally of Germany during the war, and so was Italy. But unfortunately, though, they didn't. There was the idea of making Slovakia a puppet state within Germany, but the Germans annexed it for strategic reasons against Poland. Also, they needed factories for their weapons. Anyways, Chamberlain, they didn't really do much to the invasion of Czechoslovakia. They didn't like it, but they didn't really do anything. It's unfortunate that Czechoslovakia had to suffer that fate, but they did, and they would suffer under Nazi rule. Anyways, right now, the Germans are now preparing their invasion of Poland, and they were preparing to annex lost territories during World War I, which Poland took many. Anyways, they had made an agreement with the Soviets, and they had signed a non-aggression pact, and they had also made a plan with the Soviets to split up Europe. But unfortunately, this wasn't going to matter later because Hitler planned to invade the Soviet Union, and he wanted to annex it for a greater Germany. Unfortunately, though, that's not a very good idea during the winter. Anyways, though, in 1939, on September 1st, yeah, that's it, Hitler and his forces invade Poland. It wasn't good at all. The Polish fought bravely, but when the Soviets started fighting to the east, there wasn't much they could do. They tried to fight desperately against the Germans and Soviets, but with two giants crashing down on them, there was no hope, and Poland capitulated after Warsaw was taken. The Polish resistance movements, though, would continue fighting the Germans and the Soviets occupying the region, although there was significantly more of a fight against the Germans. Anyways, the Polish regions annexed by Germany would continue to suffer throughout the war. It wasn't good, but they fought bravely against the Germans in resistance movements. Anyways, Poland had collapsed by 1940, and now Germany was fighting the British and the French. They didn't really have to worry about fighting the Soviets, after they had signed a non-aggression pact with them. Anyways, they were allies now with Italy and Hungary, but right now Italy was not at war with France and Great Britain, as they were still considering it. Anyways, the Germans right now needed a steady supply of resources in order to defeat France, and right now that's not what they had. So, they had a brilliant idea of going through Denmark into Norway, which had a lot of iron, which is needed for tanks, guns, ammunition, and that kind of thing. Anyways, the Germans pushed right through Denmark, which didn't stand a chance. They tried fighting the Germans, but the Germans' tactics were just too good for them. It wasn't good at all for Denmark. Anyways, Denmark got pushed through. German forces landed on the coast of Denmark, which Norwegian forces and British forces and a few French forces would continue gathering in there to fight the Germans. They fought bravely, but unfortunately they were no match, as the Germans had a superior air force in the region. The British, though, could have easily defeated the Germans if they had their air force ready, but they didn't, and the Germans used their air force to push all through Norway. They pushed all the way to this line here, and the province right here, this province here, I think it says Trimo. I think this region's called Finnmark, but British forces continued fighting there in little coast strips across the Norway, although they would eventually start surrendering and leaving because it was too costly to keep them. Anyways, after Norway surrendered, the Germans now wanted to get rid of France. If France fell, they would have a ton of resources, and they could easily defeat Great Britain. Anyways, the Germans prepared their tanks on the Rhine. Their plan was to do exactly what they did in World War I, go straight through Belgium. They also wanted to invade the Netherlands for the resources, and then defeat France. The French army was still super proud of their victory after World War I, and they hadn't really technologically advanced after it because they still thought they could easily still defeat the Germans. Anyways, German forces prepared here, and they punched through the Netherlands and into Belgium. Luxembourg isn't on this map, but it's a small country right next to Belgium. and it didn't stand a chance. Neither did the Netherlands or Belgium. They were pushed right through. Anyways, French forces had gathered around Belgium, and had pushed in it a small bit. But the Belgians, even though they didn't want to get invaded by Germany, they also didn't like the idea of having British troops in them, which is really odd. Anyways, they opposed it, but they didn't really do much, though, when they did. British and French forces were now along the Belgian border, and Belgium was now no more. During the time when they were fighting the Germans, they had left a region right here, next to Alsace-Lorraine, called the Ardennes, unoccupied, mostly because it was full of forests, and they thought it was naturally impenetrable by tanks. The Germans decided that they were going to go right through it with their tank divisions, and they were going to encircle France with it. And that's what they did. They took their panzer armies, and they pushed right through it. It's very unfortunate that they pushed through it. The French actually had a decent chance of winning, but they didn't. After the Ardennes were pushed through, British forces would be encircled at Dunkirk. Many would be killed for the evacuation, but many would make it home to Great Britain. After Dunkirk was evacuated, France would soon fall as the Italians would then join the war and would push across the mountains. Anyways, France fell, and the Germans annexed. Well, they occupied the north of France. They also occupied these coastal bits here, and the state of Vichy, France, was established as a German puppet. The Italians also annexed a bit of land here. Anyways, after that, the Germans had established forces and started sending forces. Whoops. That was weird. Yeah, this is much better. They started sending forces to North Africa, and fighting soon ensued there. The Germans, though, were on the shore of Great Britain attacking their Vichy, France, even though it was technically still France. Although the Great Britain responded to this by wrecking a bunch of now Vichy France-owned Navy ships in Africa. The Free French movement also began in a few colonies that weren't taken by Vichy France. This was the French Resistance Movement, or Free France, which would continue fighting the Germans in Africa. Great Britain supported this and started sending forces to reinforce in Africa, and now there was fighting in North Africa. The British also in Egypt at this time, and they were now fighting with Italian Libya. Anyways, the fighting in North Africa was bad. The Italians who have annexed Albania decided it's a good idea to invade Greece for its resources. They decided to do this, although unfortunately the incompetent Italians failed at invading Greece. A great power would fail to a minor power such as Greece, which really showed their military force and defenses. The Germans were unhappy with their incompetent ally, and they decided to start allying with states here so they can get the Greece and help Italy defeat it. This is good, though. Oh yeah, I forgot to mention something. I think after Poland was invaded, the Soviets went to war with Finland. This is known as the Winter War, but it really didn't go well for the Soviets, and it was an embarrassing loss. They still defeated Finland, sort of, but it took way too long, and it was too many resources, and they didn't really gain too much either. Anyways, back to the war. The Soviets right now, which had annexed a region here from Romania, known as Bessarabia, something like that. They annexed the region, and Romania couldn't really do anything about it, so they decided to join Germany for assistance against the Soviets, and the Germans didn't assist them with anything. But they would give them protection against the Soviets. Now with Romania, they then promised Bulgaria lands, like in World War I. They promised them Macedonia and bits of Serbia. Romania now joined on, and they had conscripted 3 states into the Axis. They tried to conscript Yugoslavia, but they refused to join the Germans, and the Germans invaded them, along with Bulgaria, Romania, and Hungary. With Yugoslavia knocked out, the Germans invaded Greece, and Greece fell. I think British forces occupied Crete, but I'm not sure. Anyways, after Greece fell, the Germans continued fighting in North Africa. But I think in 1941, they decided to go to war with the Soviet Union, which was stupid. The Germans were quite idiotic for doing this, and it was very incompetent. Anyways, the Germans went to war with the Soviet Union, which had annexed the Baltic states, and they pushed right through them. The Soviets actually thought the Germans were going to listen to them, even though they had broken many treaties before, which is unruly of them. Well, unruly of the Germans for breaking the treaties. Anyways, the Soviets were not prepared, and they got pushed back, and when their armies did arrive, many of them were encircled by German forces. Almost millions of them were encircled, but almost though. The Russians got pushed back out of modern-day Belarus, and they got pushed out of Ukraine, which was insane amounts of lands they were getting pushed out of. It was one of the biggest land invasions of history, and they were now right up next to Moscow. They had also encircled the major city of Leningrad, which, if that fell, the Soviets would be majorly demoralized. The Finnish sort of also joined the war, although their participation in World War II is quite confusing. Anyways, they had joined the war to regain worth. Finland had joined the war against the Soviets to regain land that they lost during the Winter War. And they had sort of sided with the Germans. They didn't really join the Axis. They sort of just invaded the Soviets as a side war, although nothing really too much would go on there. Anyways, the German invasion had pushed in, but it was now winter. Seeing the failures of other states during the war, many would believe that Germany was going to retreat, but the Germans didn't want to end up like Napoleon, and they decided to continue fighting for Moscow. Although this was terrible, though, and they started getting pushed back. They got pushed away from Moscow, and they were now held up along regions still in Belarus and Ukraine. Anyways, after their defeat at Moscow, they decided to sever Soviet supply lines, so it would be easier to take Moscow next time. They would continue attacking Leningrad, which bravely still held out, even being encircled by Finnish and German forces. The Germans would then decide to push for Stalingrad, which the Soviets had a lot of oil from. If they could collapse the Caucasus and take the oil, their tank divisions would have extra oil, and they could easily take Moscow. Oil was running low in Germany during this time, which made it a priority. Oh yeah, also something I forgot to mention. The Germans were not at war with America, but they wanted to starve Britain out of the war, and they also wanted to bomb them out of the war. They had intense bombing raids over Britain, and the Germans also had U-boats, which they called them, which were basically submarines and navy ships in the Atlantic, sinking supplies and merchant ships heading to Great Britain, as they hoped to starve them and break their trade, so they would leave the war. Overall, it wouldn't go too well, but there was some success in it. Anyways, the Germans were continuing to fight the Soviets. They would then the Soviets fought ruthlessly at Stalingrad. They also did fight ruthlessly at Leningrad, but they fought bravely and ruthlessly at Stalingrad, but they were no match, and they were pushed out. Although after they were pushed out of Leningrad, Hitler got a bit too optimistic. He decided to encircle the next Soviet army with barely any tanks. He had only one army to do the encirclement, and the Soviets had many armies. I'm not sure how many armies were there, but this loss was responsible for the loss at Stalingrad. After the encirclement failed, the Soviet forces decided to encircle the retreating German forces, which they did successfully, which saw them re-encircle Leningrad and would soon retake it. After this encirclement, the Germans started getting pushed back further and further. They would get further pushed out of Ukraine. The Battle of Kursk would then happen, and after that was lost, the German tanks were decimated, and they would get pushed out of Crimea, and they would also get pushed out of now today's Ukraine's capital, which saw them pushed up at the borders of Poland. Oh, whoops. Now they were pushed quite far back. Romania was considering to switch sides during this war, and the Germans were in big trouble now. The Italians were not doing well in Africa, and in 1943, in Asia, Japan, which was a member of the Axis, decided to bomb Hawaii, which was Pearl Harbor, which would be a horrible incident. Although the Japanese bombing, they didn't bomb any of the naval repair yards, or the oil reserves, or the submarine reserves, which meant that the Americans would be able to get their navy up and running soon. Being a member of the Axis, America decided to join the war, which was really bad for Germany. Germany now would have to fight in the east, and the Germans decided to up their navy so they could sink more and more British ships. Soviet forces were continuing to fight in the east, and the war wasn't going well there. With the Americans now in the war, the Germans immediately would get pushed out of Algeria, and Vichy France was starting to fail. With the failure of Vichy France, the Germans decided to invade it, although it didn't stand a chance. Anyways, after Vichy France fell, the Germans and Italians were pushed out of Africa, and the British wanted to launch an invasion into Italy from Africa. They launched an invasion into Sicily, which saw Mussolini, the leader of fascist Italy, become very unpopular, and he was kicked out. The Republic of Italy was then declared, and Italy fell into civil war. After the Civil War started, the Germans decided to invade Italy. Anyways, the Allies and the Germans continued fighting in Italy, although winter then set in Italy, and things came to a halt, as it was stalemate there. The war in the East wasn't good either. With one of their allies down, the Germans were now low on forces. Romania would then get pushed out of Bessarabia, which they would lose for a second time, and they decided to switch sides. With the Soviet forces in Romania now on the Allies side, things were not going well in the east. Bulgaria would then surrender from Soviet forces invading. Hungary would get pushed into, and they would soon surrender. The Germans were now starting to get pushed out of Poland. They would then get pushed out of Rome and Italy, and they would continue holding the north. Somewhere in 1943, I forgot the date. It's pretty stupid of me to forget this big event, and I shouldn't have, but I don't know when. Somewhere in September, I think, the Americans decided to invade France. The invasion was very successful. Many German forces were encircled, and the Germans got pushed out of France completely almost. After France fell, the Germans started suffering in North Africa, and the Soviets had now pushed out of Poland. Anyways, the Germans had now been pushed out of Poland, and the Soviet forces were almost to Berlin, which is very bad. There would be small skirmishes in the north with the Soviets and the Germans, but the Soviets decided that the Germans couldn't have those resources anymore. The Finnish signed armistice when this happened, and they allowed Soviet troops to go through them to push the Germans out of Norway, which saw the Germans no longer had any iron, which meant they couldn't make tanks as fast, and they almost couldn't make them. Now almost being tankless, the Germans started getting pushed back further and further out of France. Anyways, the Germans would then get completely pushed out of France, and the Germans would then get pushed through Belgium. Although in Belgium, the Germans then had an opportunity to do what they did many years earlier to defeat France, and they decided to do it again. They wanted to push through the Ardennes again, encircle the American and British forces in Dunkirk, and defeat France again and push them out. They tried this, but it failed horribly, and they would end up in them getting pushed out of Belgium, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands. They would also get pushed from the east into the German mainland. The British during this time had also launched an invasion through Greece. The Germans didn't stand a chance with partisans in Yugoslavia, which were fighting for Yugoslavia's liberation. They would side with the British forces and allowed them to move through them to go into Austria. Actually, no. British forces continued fighting with the Germans in Yugoslavia, but their resistance to the British forces was very weak. The Soviet forces would then continue moving and would push the Germans out of Hungary. They would then reach Vienna and Prague. After Prague fell, the Soviets would then push for Berlin. After Berlin fell, Hitler would commit suicide, and many years of suffering over Europe was ended after the German surrender. Anyways, when the Germans surrendered, Japan would soon follow soon, but that's for another video. Anyways, I'll be doing the Cold War in another video too, and I hope you enjoyed this history vid, and I'm cutting it off.